Gosh, I love being here with you. And I love living in Enfield, to be honest. And I love the stories, so I'm just full of love to you. And it's just great that you've come. And I look forward to sharing this. Now, this was an odd assignment, and there's a little story behind it. I've been involved with the State Culture and Tourism Group, and they have been talking about this thing they call placemaking, which I won't go into the details of that. But it seems that we're at a point here where there are a lot of people talking about how you strengthen people's sense of place and community. And there, 20, 30 years ago, maybe people didn't worry about that so much, but I think we live, those of us who live in Enfield are very conscious of this because we've got these very intensely convenient malls that are nonetheless filled with these global corporations that, whether it's the restaurants or the chain stores or Home Depot. So you sort of scratch your head and you think, well, now what's ours? What makes Enfield? What are our local businesses? What makes us stand out in a crowd? And I think that a lot of people are thinking about that. Communities all over think about that. And in terms of agriculture, there's hardly anything you can point to that is more grounded. I mean, you really can't export, well, no way we do. You can't entirely export your agriculture, and it is our oldest industry. So I think that this program actually came about because the State Department of Culture and Tourism and the State Department of Agriculture teamed up and said, look, we want you to pull some things together for us, and we're going to help you do it. And so I've always been interested in farming. In fact, well, this picture is right here at Enfield, but I live in the southwest corner of town. And there's nothing that happens in a year that makes me smile more than when August rolls around. And the couple weeks every year where it's just a beehive of activity with all the tobacco farmers harvesting and the carts going back and forth and they're putting it up in the sheds. And, it's for a couple weeks, it's just constant. And one of those tobacco sheds is literally I can look in my backyard and see it. And we have tobacco growing near us, and to me there's something incredibly inspiring about the idea that here is a custom, an economic function as well, that has been ongoing continuously for like 300 years, certainly for 200, right here. And so those are the kinds of things that I think ground our sense of us and our sense of place. And so let me proceed with this. This is kind of the fruits of what I amassed in talking about this. In the assignment, what I was asked to do was, pull together some information about the history of agriculture in Connecticut and show us what's going on now and talk a little bit about what the future might hold. Well, we can all only guess at that, but let me just see. Mike just showed me what to do. Am I doing it? Oh, maybe it says. Oh, sorry. Once I do it once, I'll know.
You're the guy in the red shirt.
Now, which one did you push? Oh, that one. Okay. This is sort of an amazing map that was recently published. Now, these are there has been an explosion of new farms in Connecticut. Look at the blue. The red dots are where farming is decreasing, and the blue dots are where it's actually growing. Now, that doesn't mean it's growing because these are big farms. Some of them are probably glorified farmers markets and gardens, but it does show that there's a pattern here. And again, the folks in the state, there's this whole kind of preoccupation. What do we do? What do we make? What is locally grown here? Despite the apparent benefits of globalism, we do pay less for a lot of stuff we like by outsourcing manufacturing to lower cost places. The unintended consequence of losing our capacity to make things on any scale is that no one measures, and few think about that. One thing for sure, Connecticut could never have been that arsenal of democracy we like to talk about from World War II if we hadn't been good at making things. So I think, you know, this is part of our history. It's also, to some degree, I think, part of our present. And alongside that, there is this kind of locally grown movement, especially where food is concerned. Imagine if it cost only twice what it presently does to move things around using fossil fuels. And I think that, you know, one of the craziest things, I don't even know if this is true, but I was reading something the other day, that there are apparently apple growers that ship apples to Australia to be polished, and then they ship them back. No. I mean, to be sold, it sounds nuts. And, you know, I'm not suggesting that we necessarily tax agricultural transport, but there's so many compelling reasons to sourcing things locally, and that's part of this movement. And, you know, there's an ideology around it. Not everybody will agree on these things, but top 10 reasons to buy local. It strengthens your local economy, reduces climate impact, supports community, keeps our community unique, creates more jobs, gets invest in your community. And again, there are evangelists, I guess would be a good word, for the whole think local movement in various parts of the country. And this think local, shop local, locally grown is a rising tide. It's a movement. And you know, you've got all this stuff. I don't know what to say about globalism. Again, there are things, it's amazing to me to think that things like radios and televisions cost more money in 1970 than they cost now. And 1970 dollars were worth about 10% of what today's dollars are. So we have benefited in some ways from that outsourcing, but there are negative consequences as well. The good news is the emerging societal trends favor locally grown and agriculture in a state that has an extraordinary concentration both of density and open land. That is if we don't sprawl it endlessly. But there is a lot of open land and a lot of potential farmland here. And we're seeing this. How many have been to the farmer's market in Coventry at the Nathan Hale homestead? That's the most famous one, I think. But there are many. And this process of farmers markets, we got a good one that opened last year, was it in Thompsonville?
Yeah.
And, you know, this is, again, all part of a rising tide. There's also community-supported agriculture. Now, I don't know who does that, if anyone does, but there are people that will buy shares in the output of a farm, and it's a way of distributing the costs, keeping that farming going, and this is another movement that is evolving. And then there's agritourism, and there are places in Connecticut that participate in that. I'll get back to that in a moment. But there are other places in the country that really take it seriously and have done a lot with it. One place my wife and I like to go once in a while is up to Quebec, not too far away. Has anybody been to Quebec City? You've been? Did you go to the Ile d'Orleans? There we go. Well, it is amazing. It's like this, I don't know how many miles, a 30-mile-long island in the middle of the St. Lawrence, but it's all farming, all agriculture, and they do great things with what I call agritourism, bringing it from the ground right to the retail level. And these are some of the things, again, community gardens and the whole farm-to-table movement, where restaurants and organizations will put on these events. Actually, the Nathan Hale Homestead does it, and they bring in sometimes celebrity chefs, and they, you know, and all of this is stuff that wasn't happening 10 years ago. It certainly wasn't happening 20 years ago. Farm stands. This is one right in Suffield, I think. Am I right about that, Lester?
Yep. Blancos.
Yep. So this is all part of this growing movement, and again, there are farmers markets in various parts of Connecticut, and this is, let me see where that is. Well, this is in Chester, and I think that is in Derby, or I'm not exact, I should remember, but maybe that. And again, community gardens, and we have at least one in Thompsonville that I know of, and there may be others. But, and you know, all of this is part of, these are all aspects of agriculture. When we think of, well, when people in Washington think of agriculture, they think of these mega farms with hundreds of thousands of acres, and you know, and that's not what we do in Connecticut. We don't do big we don't do big we don't have big giant farms, but there's a lot of stuff we do have that can be locally sourced. Then they talk about this whole artisanal movement and the idea that there are artisan. And to be honest with you, I don't think I ever have or ever will pay $30 a pound for cheese. But there are people that do it, and you can find places that sell cheese for that amount of money. And people, again, are looking for, I mean, I would say to some degree that Trinity Farms, that its milk products are high-end. They're a little more expensive, and they're homemade and handmade, and participate in that. This was yet another thing, and I don't know, people, I guess increasingly my age and some of your age, are retiring and starting second careers, doing more than dabbling in farming, but being somewhat successful at it. This was an article in the New York Times. So there it goes. Now, let's go back into the past. You know, when the Puritans first settled Connecticut, the Native Americans were, they were hunters and agrarians. They grew things. But when the Puritans settled here, that's the economy they had. They didn't have much else, is farming. And this is great. This is a late 19th century conjectural view of what Wethersfield might have looked like in 1650. And you can see that they are, they've got pasture land and they're growing corn. These little villages, it's pretty small scale living. And if you look at the maps of these early towns, and I think this is a picture also from about 1890. I don't think New Haven ever quite looked that clean. I think that's a little polished up, a little like if Walt Disney was trying to imagine the 17th century. But you get the idea, and there's something, and I think anywhere, whether it was the cities or the country, the scent and the sounds of oxen and agriculture were prevalent almost everywhere you look. Now, you look at these early maps, Windsor on the right, and East Windsor Hill on the left, and what these are towns, Enfield the same way. The houses were all initially laid out on one street, and they had what they called long lots that would continue. They might have the width of this room fronting the street, but then it would go back half a mile, sometimes to the river and on the other side. And then there were common lands that they shared. So this was sort of the geography of agriculture at the time. And I love these early maps because they're not that early, really. This is from the 1850s, but it shows you exactly who lived in each house along these streets, and you can look that kind of thing up. And if you want a sense of what the agrarian economy in the colonial period was like, well, Sturbridge Village does a pretty good job presenting that. And this is Plymouth Plantation, which shows an even earlier period. And I'm not completely sure how accurate it all is. I'm sure there are some things left out, but it is pretty convincing to me, and I think you really do get a sense of what life was like. And if we look at some of the early paintings that exist, there aren't many, but there are maybe a couple dozen mostly portraits of Connecticut that predate 1810 or 20, and that contain within them realistic depictions of the agrarian or agricultural, what the landscape looked like at the time. Interestingly, this is Oliver Ellsworth's house in Windsor, not far from here. And you can see the house and the barns long gone, and the fencing. This is a painting from 1792 by Ralph Earl. And I'm prepared to guess that that's almost photographic in its accuracy. That Ralph Earl didn't mess around. He would sketch things, and he would paint them as faithfully as he possibly could. You see how important fencing was? The lower view, astonishingly, is what we now call downtown Hartford. It shows Center Church and South Church in the background. And this would be up near where the Capitol is presently. So you get far off Main Street in 1790 in Hartford, and it's pretty much farmland right into the city, even then. So that's the world we lived in. These are some great views. And I had to dig around to find these, I gotta be honest. There aren't many of them. But this shows Willimantic, about 1830, I believe. And again, you can see how agriculture encroached right in the heart of these villages. That if you go up to, again, Old Deerfield, which is still got a lot of agriculture, you also there get a sense. In places like Hatfield and East Windsor Hill to some degree, where you can see the main street and the housing, and the agriculture is really right there still. And you get a sense of pretty much what the world of colonial Connecticut was like. And interestingly, this is an artist that you go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, almost any major art museum, George Dury from New Haven, shown here. His works are famous. And he was the greatest inspiration. Currier and Ives, who popularized this sort of romantic New England look, these village-scapes in the middle of the 19th century, based quite a few of their pictures on paintings by this guy. And actually, the Springfield Art Museum has one of the largest collections of Currier and Ives anywhere, so if you like that. But it's interesting, you look at Currier and Ives to people is kind of like almost like a cliche of what New England was supposed to be or supposed to look like. And the big question that no book that I am aware of has answered is how accurate and faithful to reality were these pictures. And his sketch, there are sketchbooks that survive, so we know he did field sketches, but are these somewhat imaginary landscapes, or did they actually depict real places with some accuracy? Now we know for sure that this is a real place depicted with some accuracy, because that's West Rock in New Haven. And that, if you took away the cart and the horse and the people, you know, the geologic features are still very much intact. But he was based in Connecticut, and he presumably did most of his sketching here, but I can't say for sure how accurate they are. But these are, again, farmscape views that give us a sense of what that, and these are more by Currier and Ives and George Dury. So this is, and I love it. I think it's, I'm trying to think of the Suffield Historical, or who around here who's done ice cutting in the winter?
We sponsor a demonstration up in Granville.
Okay, you do or they do?
No, we sponsor with the Granville Museum.
Okay, yeah, and that's an interesting thing to observe, and that's what we're seeing here is ice harvesting. They didn't have electricity, so they had to stockpile the ice. And did that last all 12 months? I think maybe it did, at least from winter to winter, that they were able to stockpile enough of it. And these were some of the tasks of the quintessential. Here is the print, and then Travelers Insurance Company made these courier knives famous because they adopted them for their promotional work. Other artists have helped us visualize this agrarian landscape of Connecticut, and one of the other neat things is that Connecticut was sort of close enough to New York City that when New Yorkers wanted to have a New England experience in the 19th century, this was pretty close. And they could cross over from Manhattan, the artists and the people that liked to buy this impressionist art. And so it spawned a real boom in the production of art, and artists found patrons, and there were places like Coscob and Kent and Niantic and Old Lyme that became popular with these artists who would come sometimes for the summer and they'd sketch. And so these are just some of the hundreds and hundreds of views. I mean, it would be fun to organize an exhibit of the Connecticut landscape, just focusing on these wonderful paintings. There probably are 1,000 of them in circulation. And they range from the 1880s, people like J. Allen Weir and who were pioneers in what we call American Impressionism, right up to Eric Sloane, who was very much around and still painting in the 1970s. And so these are all Connecticut scenes. Child Hassan on the lower right there of the Bush Holly House in Coscob in Greenwich. And if you've ever been to Greenwich, Connecticut, it's kind of hard to imagine that there were farms there 100 years ago, but there were. And so for the artist, going to Greenwich was really getting out into the country. Wallace Nutty, the famous photographer, and he was an antiques collector. He wrote books about antiques. 1904, he moves to Southbury, Connecticut, and starts a farm. And his favorite thing was photography, and he did a little farming, but he did a lot of photography. And I think part of the point of the farming was to give him subject matter for his photographs. And these are some of his pictures that he did in those early years. On the lower right is again Child Hassan showing an oyster slough in Coscob. Another facet of agriculture has to do with aquaculture, and so this is what we. And again, other artists. This is Thomas Nason, was in East Haddam, and he did a lot of these beautiful wooden engravings. This is again all Connecticut subject matter. This is a Macedate Chafee photographing also in East Haddam. And this is an artist on the lower left named Rockwell Kent, who also painted here. So, showing here again some of the ways that art reflects this agrarian heritage of ours. I always love the story. This is engraved. This is actually sculptural carving on the facade of our state capitol. I'm sure you all know what this scene is. Somebody will get it. Not you, Judy. You know. Oh, yes, you do. Who knows what we're looking at
Is
here?
that Putnam?
Yes. And what's he doing?
Oh, he's dropping the plow and taking up his rifle.
There we go. And he's off to Lexington, Concord. The sound of the alarm. What was our most illustrious general doing when the Revolutionary War started? Well, he was busy doing what Connecticut people did. He was farming. And so this is part of his legend. He drops the plow, he gets the news, and he's off and running to the Battle of Lexington. And that's, again, that's part of our state narrative and mythology, is this idea of people running off to these alarms. The other thing I just loved, this was the coolest thing for this project, and the University of Connecticut has this thing called Yukon Magic, and it's a website. I think you can Google it. And they've got all these maps that are online, and they're so huge. I've never downloaded anything off the internet. I think it was, some of these were 120 gigabyte files, if that means anything to you. And at least on my computer, it took about 20 minutes to download it. But once you've done, what it is they've got all these amazing county maps. And that's a lecture I'd love to attend sometime if somebody's giving them. Maybe Judy or somebody knows. But there was a big movement in the 1850s. Suddenly map making took off, and they generated all these amazing maps for each county and for many towns. I don't think there's one for Enfield. Maybe Mike would know.
Yeah, there is. Yeah. Yes, there is.
From the 1850s?
Yes. We have one in our museum.
There is one?
Yes.
Okay, then, because many towns had these, and what they do is, you look at this, there's so much going on, it's hard to almost process it. But what's great about these files at UConn is that they're so huge that when after you've downloaded it, if you want to look at like just this little piece here, you can blow it up 8 by 10 and you can see everything. And they're so interesting because these maps show what was going on economically in Connecticut at that time. And these are just some, they also illustrated them with these little pictures around the borders. I'll go back, see if I can go back. Oh, I don't need to go back. I don't know how to go back. Let me try to go back. Yeah, like all this stuff around the borders. I mean, people bought these things as art, I suppose. They would hang them in their houses, and they loved these maps. And there was a commercial market for these. I'm sure they weren't inexpensive.
Hey, Bill?
Yeah.
Up in the top middle there, it also gives you distance between towns. See like the triangle there, up in the top?
Oh yeah.
That gives you the distance between towns.
Yeah, it's so great. These things are just, I was joking, you could teach a whole course just on these maps, what you could glean from them. They're so incredible. And again, so when Connecticut imagines itself in this period, it starts to think, okay, how do we convey a sense of who we are and what we do? The images that they still put forward, you think of Connecticut as Yankee ingenuity and industrialization, but the industrialization never crowded out agriculture entirely. And in the 1850s, there was much more. Even though most of the boom in agriculture moved west with the Erie Canal and the railroads by this period, it didn't wipe out by any stretch of the imagination what was going on with agriculture back home. So these are some of the great little images that they put on those maps. And it's also interesting, I love these scenes that show, these are the people that I suppose have money, substance and whatever. And so, and maybe they paid a little extra to get their house included in the map. I mean, if your house, and I know like the Enfield, if it were Enfield, you'd see Augustus Hazard's house would be on there, and Oris Thompson. I mean, those are the kind of folks whose houses wound up in these little pictograms. But again, look at what they show. They still show farms and agriculture and an economy based on the horse. So they're really neat. And I love this. These are all from these maps. Look at these amazing, according to the census of 1850, this is Fairfield County. Well, Bridgeport is already taken off. There's 7,000 people there. And Stamford. So anytime you see a number bigger than 2,500, it's probably a good bet that there's more than agriculture going on. But if you look at New Canaan, that's probably not much more than agriculture going on. And in Monroe, definitely not more than agriculture going on. Or maybe a little more, they might have a sawmill or something. But look at these small populations, 59,000 people in all of Fairfield County in 1850, which is about a third the population of Hartford today. And then if you look at these, this is Wyndham County, yeah. pretty amazing, isn't it? And yet, look where the action is there. Killing, well, that's an industrial, was a mill town. And certainly, Wyndham, which is Willimantic, that 4,500, that's beginning to pick up. Thompson, which is North Grosvenordale, which is, again, these are some of the mill towns that were beginning to take off in this period. But the rest, look at Little Hampton. Hampton, even today, is incredibly rural feeling. It's not too far from Yukon. They had 946 people in 1850, but they probably don't have twice that today. Maybe they do. And the amazing thing, I learned this statistic years ago. As recently as 1940, most of the towns in Connecticut, this is an astonishing fact, most of the towns in Connecticut had smaller populations than they had in 1800. As recently as 1940, that the modern age that we know, the sprawl, the suburbanization, the growth, most of that happened after the Depression. And from 1800, many of these little towns had I won't say they peaked, but they were built out, and they never were going to get much bigger for 150 years after 1800. And this is great. Comparative view of the agricultural condition of Hartford County. You can see, I won't go into all the details, but sheep, cows, oxen, rye, Indian corn. You can see from 1840 to 1850. Again, there's so much analysis one could do with all of this is on these wonderful maps. And you take any, Lebanon is famous, because it's still actually one of the most concentrated agricultural economies in the state. And if you know Lebanon, the famous green, which is long, there it is, and you can find out everybody who was living there. But you can tell from these maps, most of these dots represent farms. Every once in a while you'll see a school or maybe a little mill or some kind of commercial thing. And when there are significant clusters of population, as there are in the center, there's going to be more commerce. But these dispersed names, where they're spread out, where there's J.B. Clark here, and General Tilden there, and S. Bascom there, those are all going to be individual farms. And this is Grandin and Colebrook. And again, you can see this is all stuff you can do with these Yukon maps. And I could have taken just this section and blown it up as big as this, and then you'd see every name in particular. So they're really quite remarkable from the 1850s. And every county got the treatment. Photographically, reading the photographic evidence, there's a lot you can read into that. And some of these pictures I got off the internet. Belong to Connecticut Historical Society, Mystic Seaport, University of Connecticut, State Library, New Haven Museum, and I couldn't cover everywhere. So, but I wanted to have a lot of material to work with in amassing these pictures. So I actually went to two communities, Guilford and Norfolk, which happen to have the local historical societies, and really the Enfield Historical Society has amazing photographs and postcards. So you can do this, almost any local historical society is going to be a treasure trove for photographic evidence. But those are the places I primarily looked. And this is Guilford, the upper picture, Norfolk, lower right, and Storrs, Yukon, what is now Yukon, Horse Farm Hill in the lower left. And the one obvious thing you notice in all of these is like, where are the trees? And one of the statistics I've heard from the forestry people is that at the height of the agrarian age, the agricultural era, Connecticut, 70% of the land was cleared and 30% was trees. Today, those numbers have almost flipped. So 70% of our land is timber, trees today, so you don't get those big open vistas that they had. If you were standing in any of these places today, you wouldn't see as much. This is our world, you know. And I'm old enough, I remember when I was a kid, we used to go skiing in western New York where I grew up, and sometimes you take these little back roads and you were trying to get somewhere, and suddenly you'd be driving along, and some farmer was there, cows were crossing, and you'd have to stop and wait for all the cows to get through. And that was not an unusual thing to observe, but there it is. And this is great. This is the green in Guilford. And, you know, they have these agricultural fairs, and they, having a pair of oxen was like a status symbol. It was like your car, you know, and people love going to town and showing off their oxen and their vehicles. And this is Guilford without the oxen, and this is Guilford with, I don't know what's going on there. And I love these wonderful early photographs of families. You know, if you were taking it'd be interesting for any family to think about this. What would be, if you were taking a portrait of your family, and you got the kids, mom, dad, the kids, grandma, whoever was living with you, and where would you pose them, and what would you pose them with? You know, and they all had an answer, not all, but of course indoor photography was a little more difficult in those days anyway. But they loved coming outside, and you just wouldn't bring in with just having the kids. You and the family, you have to bring in some of the things that show what you do. So the beloved oxen, and the hay wagon, and the horse and plow. These are all Connecticut images, family portraits that convey a sense of. And you know, there's other things you can read into today. I put this. Many houses, I'm prepared to almost say most houses. Somebody here might know better than I, but I'm going to say maybe most houses in 1840, people just didn't paint them. So they, you know, when you think of a colonial house with its picket fence and white paint, that's probably more unusual than typical. And I would say this look is a little bit more typical. And I don't think that house ever had paint. It's still standing, probably does now. And aren't these great? And these are all Connecticut scenes. Look at those oxen. These guys, they're happy. They like showing off. And what a great house that is. Yum, yum. And the different things that the cows did. This is hauling tobacco, the oxen, and hauling lumber. Is that witch hazel up there? Harvesting and transporting witch hazel. Stacking and packing hay. These were familiar scenes of daily life in the 19th century. This is interesting. Salt marsh. Hay, they would harvest hay from, I think, islands in inaccessible places and drag it along around in these little boats. And, hauling rocks, inevitably getting stuck in the mud season in April. They had problems back then too. But now UConn, most of you probably know, was founded as an agricultural college. It was originally known as Connecticut Agricultural College. That was its name, and this was the main building as it looked in 1893. And this is pictures of UConn during the Farm Week Parade, which continued, I don't know if it did continue into the 1950s. This certainly looks like it could be that recent, maybe even 1960s, but these are scenes of student life in the age before basketball. Poultry, well, people in Enfield know a lot about that because we were seriously deep into chickens around here at one time. And you still see the chicken coops and barns, but this was Yukon as well. They had experimental farms and agricultural science, and it was a place that actually put Connecticut in some ways on the cutting edge of the science of agriculture. So it served that purpose. And there are lots of firsts. We think of the things that Connecticut is famous for. I don't believe everything I'm told, but I'm prepared to believe this. This is a book that was about a farmer named Ratchford Starr in Litchfield, who allegedly was perfected milk bottling. It was the first milk bottling plant in the United States in the 1880s, and there's a book written about that. And again, it's hard to believe when you think of Greenwich, that close to New York City. But these are pictures, and actually the oldest house in Greenwich is the Nathaniel Lyon house shown in the upper right there. This poor house, it's been moved about 3 or 4 times, and it's been a long time since it had since it looked like this, but this is what it looked like maybe in the 1880s and 90s, and you can see that agriculture was right there. And these, again, Greenwich, New Canaan, the same point I made earlier about dispersed homesteads and farms, all of this, that whole backcountry region of Greenwich, where houses start at $5 million and go up to 40, and there are like 100 of them. It just boggles your mind. That was all farms, 100, even 90, 80 years ago. And again, these are just more. This is Woodstock. Looks a little like Appalachia, doesn't it? But there you go. And somebody's converted barn is a store, and they probably do everything that you need to buy there. One little project that I was involved in New Hartford that just still astonishes me. This is such an amazing thing. They had, I used to drive by this in the 80s, and I'd look at this building, this blacksmith shop on Route 202 heading toward Torrington, and it always interested me. I remember pulling over a couple times and looking in the windows. Well, what this is a blacksmith shop. And the neat thing about it is this guy, George Jones, who his grandfather built it in the 1830s, and he apprenticed to his father in the 1880s, and he was still working this thing in the 1950s with the same tools and really like a time capsule, untouched. And the great thing, not only does the blacksmith shop survive, but everything that was ever in it. There's a collection of like 5,000 objects and all the archival material. And one of the things I've been working with the New Hartford Historical Society to try to save this and preserve it. But if you go around, again, the thing I love about local history and our community-based historical societies is there's always collections, unique things in them that tell the story of what our communities did or what they might have made at one point or another, and these are agricultural tools. I hope some of you have been out to the Eric Sloan Museum in Kent. That's a great thing to do. And Eric Sloan is pretty well known because he wrote, I think there are probably hundreds of thousands of his books that have been sold about early American life, but he was a tool collector, and he just beautifully presented at the little museum out there in Kent. These are pictures from the Eric Sloan Museum, and then these are some things from the Winstead Historical Society, which they happen to make science from there. That was one of their local industries. Our agricultural fairs, I always like going to the Ford Town Fair. It's a great one. It's not the oldest one, if you believe them. Again, I tend to believe what I'm told. Established 1809, I think the one in Brooklyn there is the oldest continuous in Connecticut. Maybe others will claim that, I'm not sure. But these are all the different ag fairs. And so again, it shows the lingering of this tradition. You can also find again, in our local historical societies, lots of printed matter and memorabilia that talks about agriculture and its presence. Segments of Connecticut agriculture, not to leave out the sea. We have these two sort of slightly divergent worlds here in Connecticut, which is the inland economy, where tobacco, wheat, livestock were raised, and then you've got the agrarian economy oriented toward Long Island Sound. And we were over on Long Island a couple of years ago, poking around, and there's a museum there where I photographed this map. And all those red spots show concentration of the oyster industry. And apparently, by 1890, 50,000 people worked in the oyster industry in Connecticut and Long Island Sound. And I don't know the exact statistics, but I think I've heard that they produced a significant share of the total national demand for oysters. So that this was one of our specialties. And people, before the age of pizza, that's what people, they go out to bars and restaurants. And you know, if you were a student at UConn, or probably more like Yale because it was right there on the water, if you were a student at Yale in 1890 and young guys want to go out and have a little fun, they'd go out to a bar and they'd have oysters and beer. That's pretty much, that was the snack food of that period. And it was an amazingly concentrated industry. And there are lots of bad things that have happened environmentally, and some beyond our control, you know, invasive diseases that killed off the lobsters a few years ago, but then they sometimes come crawling back. And I think oysters really took a hit in the 1990s, but it's not completely out, and but it is a fraction of what it was a century ago. And then, of course, our beloved tobacco. I was joking, my wife, some of you know, we could do this in Enfield too, is the director of the Windsor Historical Society. And I always think when, now our U.S. Senator Richard Blumenthal, when he was Attorney General, he spent a lot of time going after the tobacco companies, and they got a lot of money in settlements from the tobacco companies. So the state has like this big designated fund that they probably mostly pay their general bills from. But it's supposed to be for tobacco education. And I think it would be just great to get that fund to sponsor. We can bring back we don't have to call it the Cigar Tobacco Harvest Festival, or maybe we do, but this must have been a ball, and you could incorporate into that some health education so people don't get the wrong message that this is good for you. But I don't suppose too many people in this room wish the tobacco industry would go away. I certainly don't. People are always going to be doing this, and if it's something that keeps agriculture going in Connecticut, then I guess I'm sort of for it. But this is great. And you know, we've got in Hazardville, most of you know, the Connecticut Valley tobacconist. I went in there. They sell expensive cigars, and that's a pretty neat store. And I thought, gee, here this thing is in Hazardville. These are pretty expensive cigars. Are there enough people in Enfield and Long Meadow that smoke cigars and can keep this business going? Well, no, is the answer. It's sort of a front for their mail order business. 90% of their sales are mail order, and all over the world. And it is, and as they explained to me, you can get a real education in there if you want, and you can buy cigars in there where they can tell you the exact farm, whether it's the Jarmocks or the Christian Brothers in Granby or whatever. They can tell you the exact farms the wrappers came from. And I didn't know this because I'm not really a smoker, but that the wrappers are what give cigars their taste. And that I did know that the Connecticut Valley cigar wrappers were the golden standard internationally. And that is certainly true. So that's part of our history, and these are these specialty firms. You've also got, again, oysters. And these are paintings from the 1930s, that during the Depression, Franklin Roosevelt, they had this, their stimulus package consisted of putting artists back to work, painting murals for courthouses and schools and libraries. And there's some great, great murals that were produced, and these are just some of the illustrations in black and white that often depict local industries, local activity, and this is, of course, again, oysters. Just, amazing. There's so much to learn about each of these individual economies. And this shows New Haven Harbor. These are all, and I don't fully understand all of this, but people would own the rights to specific plots, just pinpointed on the map where they could harvest oysters, and then the guy next to you was somebody else. But actually, New Haven Harbor was substantial. You can see all along the coast. These are all the areas where there was a lot going on with oyster harvesting. Maps. And the shells. If you were in Fairhaven, Connecticut in 1920, you would have seen these mountains of oyster shells everywhere, because that's what they did there. And these are great. Actually, as part of my research, there is a state, it's a center of aquaculture down in Milford, where they have archives and they do science and testing and regulations for aquaculture. So I went down. These are just some of the pictures that I was able to scan. It's great, just the various processes. And again, this is still going on. I'm not going to say it's ever going to come back in a big way, but it was still very much in a big way in the 1970s and 80s. These are not old photographs. These are photographs from 60s, 70s. And we love our shad. Since the 17th century, the Connecticut River has been, people have been fishing for shad and selling shad and processing it, and there are, the Windsor has a shad derby, and there is a Buddhist Sportsman Club has a big shad bake that they do in the spring, and there's a shad museum. I've never been, but apparently there is a shad museum in Haddam. And then our beloved tobacco sheds, and these are just scenes right around town here in Enfield. And it really, to me, it's always exciting. And I've had times when the sheds were filled, and if you stand in front of them, and if the wind is blowing the right way, it's just like being bathed in this aroma. It's great. And this is the planting in the spring and the shade grown. These are all familiar sights. But if you didn't live here, they'd be incredibly unfamiliar, because this is something that doesn't really, it's a very distinctly homegrown. Actually, that's the picture I took. Was it right here on, I'm not sure it was Post Office Road. I think it might have been. Huh?
Raffia?
Yeah, it might have been Raffia. But I took that picture. The day I took that picture, you could see the back is open, and the wind was blowing right through it, and it was just like, it was like being in a perfume parlor. It was amazing. These are all pictures taken in Connecticut. And this is the tobacconist. This is right here in Hazardville. And then, again, some of our museums. Is this Enfield Historical? Lower left? Yep. So the Enfield Historical Society presents, has wonderful stuff related to a lot of different aspects of Enfield's history, including agriculture, and certainly the tobacco is part of that. And we won't go into great detail about chickens, though I did find, I had an out-of-town guest from California recently. We took a little drive. We went over to Brooklyn so he could see a chicken farm. And, you know, this is some of the stuff that we did. These broilers, we were famous for them. And what was the business? Pilfer? Pilcher? Pilcher. When did they go out? 1970s? Is that pretty much where the malls are now?
No.
Where were they?
Rich's Oil.
Oh, Moody Road, okay. Well, they weren't the only ones, but they were big. Big. This is great. My wife and I were out driving. You don't see this. There are almost none of these left, but we were in Voluntown, which is like one of the smallest towns in Connecticut. And I'm driving by, and you see a lot of these chicken sheds and barns, and you see them right here in Enfield, but they're always empty. There's nothing going on in them anymore. And I looked, I said, there's chickens in there. So I stopped, and I wanted to take a picture. And if you ever had, like, self-esteem issues, and you, like, felt like you needed a little ego boost because people didn't love you enough, you know, haven't we all had that feeling from time to time? Hang with these chickens, because it's the most incredible experience. When you walk up to the window, as I did to take a picture, suddenly thousands of them get up at once and just look at you adoringly. And it's an experience I've never had before or since. But the only problem is that they stink to high hell. This is one of the most repulsive smells. To stand here and take these pictures was almost difficult, but I got them, and that was just a couple of years ago. And maple syrup, I mean, I could go on and on with these, but there are lots of, actually, we are, even as we speak, the sap is running, and we tapped a couple maple trees in our yard, and we had already made a quart. How's that? So that's about it. That's about what we'll get. But some of these folks, Pat and Bob, have 1,400 taps. Bob here and Lamothe, I forget where they are, 5,000 taps. So we do have our own homegrown, and there is a maple association. And of course, dairy. Now, somebody here might know, this picture is right here in Enfield, and I could almost throw a snowball from my house and hit it. That is a dairy barn, and a big one. And I don't know that it was ever used, or if it was used, it was not used very long. I doubt that it's any older than the 1950s, but there it is. And aside from Trinity Farms, I'm trying to think if there's any other dairy in Enfield. I'm not sure that it is. Where? Oh, Collins, of course. Yeah, Collins. But there are places in Connecticut that still have, and there we go, Trinity Farms. And I was astonished after I created this program this past year. Trinity Farms doubled their plant, their facility. They built this larger than the one they had, new barn. So I think what that's telling me, I haven't asked them, but I think they're growing. I think they're doing pretty well. And, or they wouldn't be expanding. And so here we are. They do a lot. They're clever. They have eggnog at Christmas, chocolate milk, and they different kinds of cream and things that they make, and it's great. And you can see this was not that unusual if you ever, and I know Enfield Historical, I don't know if some of these pictures I don't always remember where I took them. Might have been Enfield Historical, some of them, but I think these were out at Yukon at the ice cream dairy restaurant that people go, well, if you pause long enough before you immediately go for the ice cream, which normal people do, you will notice that there is actually historical exhibits in that building, and they have a lot of these milk bottles on display, and there probably are hundreds of branded dairies around Connecticut that produce their own bottles and their own wrappers, and they're kind of fun to collect. And you see anywhere, you know, if it says Reading and Westport, Connecticut, that means there were dairy farms there when these bottles were made. And then you've got this amazing thing. This is designer cows. They made a lot of news. This is out in Brookfield. This is this Arethusa farm. that for a couple of years had the world's record for a cow. And I wouldn't think you could pay $500,000 for a cow. But I guess if it's got the right genes, like you will. And so they've got really expensive pampered cows out there. And you know that when you take the gallon to the checkout and it costs 3 times as much as it would at Stop and Shop. But I can't say for sure that I know the difference, but somebody must, and it is great, and they are flourishing. And then our farmer's cow, these people have been smart. This is good marketing, good branding. It's a consortium of 6 farms out in eastern Connecticut that have created a co-op, and they've got all these products, and you can go to Geisler's, or almost all the stores here carry them. And it is, again, a way to support the continuing, ongoing production of our various farms. The Cromwell Growers Greenhouses, and again, I'm not an expert on all this, but this is expanding and it's more than flowers. It's an international movement that involves hydroponics, and again, the science of agriculture. Things are always in flux and always in change. And this is down in Cromwell, and it's really pretty amazing. I mean, am I right about this? Is this you? Since you're from Cromwell, you must know. But it's a big operation. How long have they been around? About 10 years. 10 years? And this is my next door neighbor, right on Pleasant Road in Enfield here, and he's got greenhouses and he has flowers in the spring, and again, it's part of an ongoing, and there are lots of the farms that are here in Connecticut that some are more successful than others, but marketing becomes kind of a key element of that. Wineries. An explosion in wineries in Connecticut over the past 20 years, and these are just, they've even had, some friend of mine described it as the state tourism people created this wine trail, and somebody described it as the drinking and driving trail, which on the surface of it doesn't really sound like a great idea, but in theory you can drive all day and hit up 8 or 9 different wineries and do tastings at each one. And I don't know how you fare at the end of the day, but there are some good ones, and they're mostly in the east and in the west, in Litchfield County. These are some examples from right here. And, you know, it's pretty amazing. What?
That one with the sunflower?
Yeah.
I love it.
Okay. We got an endorsement. That's good. Sachem's Picnic. Oh, that's Hopkins. They're up in the northwest. Yeah.
Very good.
And then this is the other thing happening. We just, after I took this picture, we've now got the Powder Hollow Brewery. Well, I don't suppose the ingredients are local, the hops, although it's possible that could be at some point. But it is, again, part of this sort of locally grown movement that is affecting agriculture and a great many other things. We also know that the seed industry, which still exists in Wethersfield and in other places, and right here in Enfield, our Shakers were famous for the seeds that they produced and sold and marketed. And lime and oranges. Connecticut does not specialize in commodities like soybeans or do anything on a grand scale, but there are a couple big players that do well by diversifying, doing wholesale to retail and smart marketing. And certainly the lime and orchards is one. Bishop's Orchards in Guilford is another. And has anybody ever been to their store in Guilford? It's pretty amazing. Yeah, they have, they have things that they don't grow or make. So it's a whole kind of high-end grocery store experience. But at any given time of year, well, maybe not in the middle of winter, a substantial portion of what they sell is stuff they do grow or that is locally sourced. And it's very interesting. what they do. Blue Slope Farm Museum in Franklin. And again, people just, farmers being clever. This Econ Hill, they have ice cream, they have a corn maze. This was amazing. We were out there at Econ Hill a couple years ago. And it's on Route 169, which I think is like the prettiest road in Connecticut. It goes from, Woodstock all the way down to Norwich. And we're driving along, and all of a sudden, there are dozens of cars pulled over by the side of the road in the middle of nowhere. I'm going, what is this? And it turned out, well, it started out as a double rainbow. People always like double rainbows. But it was this just amazing vista of this dairy farm and the double rainbow. And it fascinated me that everybody pretty much on that road at that point thought this was a big enough deal that they stopped their cars to take a close look. And that's why we love Connecticut, because there's a lot of beautiful things like that we can do and see. I lived in Vermont for 10 years before I moved here. They had a thing, I don't think we do this, but they called them bicentennial farms. Any farm that was 200 years old and it's still running in Vermont got a plaque and some recognition. I don't know that we have a program that does that, but there are these farms in Connecticut that have been in business, in some cases for 250 years. This couple, they're out in Ashford, and these are the Knowltons, and I was amused. I said, Ashford, Knowlton, Thomas Knowlton, that was Nathan Hale's commanding officer in the American Revolution. Any relation? Oh yeah, that was my great, and his farm has been in the family since the colonial period, so it happens. And this guy, Stafford, just over the line from Summers. Beef cattle, Christmas trees. I'm going to move through some of this. Just the point is to remind us of the diversity of what we do. The pick your own. This is also literally in Enfield, right across the street from my house. A couple acres of strawberries that this fellow manages during the spring. The Grange is what it is, but some of them are still active. They were a national order, fraternal organization founded in 1867, oldest agricultural advocacy group of national scope. Among other things, they pressed for rural free delivery and got it. Centers of Rural Life, this is the Grange in Scotland, Connecticut. Farmland Trust, nonprofit organization that, we've got state programs and there's money if people are willing to sell their land or the development rights to their land. That's a way to protect the ongoing agricultural use of that land. And Connecticut chapter of Northeast Organic Farming Association. All these specialized groups and again, local distributors that make a point of promoting locally grown. I think Big Y does it, not to plug any one more than another. I think Big Y and Geisler's in particular do a pretty good job of, promoting locally grown, but we can all, if we choose, urge our supermarkets to be conscious of that and to let people know that we like locally sourced stuff. Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation is created. This is a self-guided barns tour. They did an expansive research project, and these are some of the barn buildings one sees as we travel around the state. When I first started out, my first job out of college, I worked in historic preservation for the state of Vermont, and I put 15 towns on the Vermont Register, and I spent a lot of time on farms talking to farmers. And you go to some of these places, and they might have 8, 9, 10 buildings. And it was always interesting to me. The farmers, if you engage them, could tell you what each one of these things was designed to do, each building. And each building often had a kind of specialized purpose. Organizations doing public programming, like this one tonight, and others, to promote interest and awareness of our agricultural heritage. The Department of Agriculture is involved. You know, they've got websites and promotional work that they do, promoting, you know, again, different facets of agriculture. Studying the trends. This is, I don't know if this is exactly correct, but this is the number of farms in each part of Connecticut. Apparently, there are almost 1,000 in Litchfield County. Farms to schools. Some of our schools source local produce. This is their analysis of the economic impact. Oh, and this is aquaculture. There's a magnet school in Bridgeport on this subject. Community Investment Act, which has been kind of a little controversy because the governor's current budget X's out all the money from the Community Investment Act. And some of this stuff in politics is a little bit of a game of cat and mouse. You never really completely know. But the advocates for the Community Investment Act, they go up to the Capitol and they make it clear to our legislators that they want that back. And who knows where the chips will fall. But the Community Investment Act is interesting. It supports historic preservation, open space, and agriculture. And if you Google that, you can find out lots of details about it. The Hartford Regional Market, they've got a big plan for redeveloping that and expanding on it. And I won't go into all the details. There we go. That's the dairy bar in Yukon. I like those kids all covered with chocolate ice cream. I don't know what to make of that picture, but they look happy. And if they're happy, I'm happy. But I was even happier when they got it done. Because they scoop it up in here. And this is behind the scenes. You get to look in there, and if you go at the right time of day, they're really making stuff. These are, again, pictures taken right here in Enfield. Face of Connecticut, artists who have, again, Jack McConnell is one photographer, a guy named Markham Starr. These are people that have gone deep into documenting contemporary farmland. Alas, we will always have problems with sprawl places, and it's been a rough 30, 40 years where people used to live in the cities and now they live mostly in suburbia. And with that came an Enfield, probably more than most places. And again, there are people in this room that know a lot more about Enfield than I do. But if you told me that in 1950, was the population of Enfield like 7,000 back then? Does anyone know? Even in 1920 there could have been 15,000? 1950, I mean?
Because in 1914 it was 10,000.
Oh, okay, all right. So for some reason I thought, it certainly grew a lot since
44,000.
Yeah, about 44,000 now. So, with that comes, you're with housing, you're going to lose some farms, but it's oh, let me go back there. That's it. That's what I think I came here to talk about. And go back. So much more to learn, and again, I'm always a champion for local history, and I think that the work that our local historical societies do, nobody else is going to do it for us. There are textbooks on American history. And don't expect any of them to say a word about Connecticut. So we've got to take our own side all the time. So I know there are refreshments. Any comments, questions, or? I know I missed some things. Yes.